Hi class, this video is to discuss your signature assignment for this class, which is going to be a paper. And I want to talk to you about it a little bit because I've written a lot of stuff down, but sometimes I think it's helpful when you get something a little described to you. So really the purpose of this paper is for you to evaluate your upbringing, how you currently live, and relating that to the material that we've covered, specifically looking at the social aspect of the way you're raised, the cultural aspect of the way you were raised. Remember, culture can be a lot of things. Culture can be an Idaho culture. Culture can be your nationality culture. I'm Italian, for example. Culture is really how it's defined. And we've read a lot about that in our textbooks, right? Culture can even be a place where you live. And you know that because if you know the North End has a sense of culture versus maybe Meridian has a different feel. And so you are going to really look through the lens of the material that you've been discussing to look at the culture with which you were raised, the social aspects of your childhood, and also not only how it was and how it is now, but what type of predictive factors then will you be able to evaluate for what will happen later in life. You know, for example, if you're pretty hypokinetic today, which means you have lack of movement, and you have kind of a poor diet, and maybe you actually live in a food swamp, or a food desert, Nampa campus almost meets that criteria. And so what does that mean? What is projected for your overall health in your future? And so these are the types of things that we're going to evaluate. What I've asked you to do is in a formal way, in a formal paper, really take these questions into consideration. You should address every single one of these questions, but of course you're not going to type the question and answer it. You're going to put it in paper form. Okay. And so really evaluating your course material, and then identifying what current factors affect your health choices today, right? Because that's a lot of what we've talked about. If we look back at behaviors of change models, right, and the health belief model and transtheoretical model, all of these things, right? These things all play a role in the types of behaviors we have, or the types of behaviors we are or are not willing to change. And so I also want you to look at the cultural differences and similarities. This is really important. Why is it that something is the one way for you and one way for someone else? What makes it harder for someone else to address change or to have access? I also think it'd be really good if you don't want to necessarily relate to a culture around you, that you could relate outside. I think leaning on the textbook here would be really helpful. There's a lot of conversation, especially in the most recent chapters, around China, which is a great example of what happens when we go through the nutrition transition, right? Because we've watched them in our lifetime go from a third world to a first world country, and Jordan, Brazil are really on their way for that. And so those would be great chapters to lean on. And really now looking at how does your behavior then reflect out, right? We talk a lot about in this class the burden of disease. Well, what does that mean? What does the burden of that disease mean? And so looking at, well, if I am engaged in healthy or unhealthy behaviors, what does that mean for my neighbor? What does that mean for my children? What will that mean for, if my parents did that, does that mean that I am now employed in taking care of them because their morbidities stack up because their age, with a young age, right? This difference in life between how long we live for, longevity versus quality, right? Because if our longevity is there, which in a first world country it is, we've talked a lot about fertility rates and mortality rates and things like that. So if longevity is there, but quality is decreasing, then that means we spend a longer period of time diseased and sick. And that's a large portion of what begins to happen in a first world country. And so how do our behaviors today affect that greater community outcome? And you can look at that through a lot of different lenses. You can look at it through a social lens, but you can also look at it through an economic lens. For example, how expensive is healthcare today in the U.S.? Our burden of disease contributes significantly to that. Lots of fun things you can do here, so feel free to explore. And then also kind of take a look at that interconnectedness of those consequences, right? And how that relates to your material. So the paper itself, a minimum of 5 pages. There's no penalty for going over. Just make it full of substance. No need for a reference page or an abstract. You can use any reference style of your choice. I'm an APA person, but you could use MLS, MLA. It doesn't matter as long as a form is utilized. In addition, you need to have 5 different references, and you need to cite within the body of your paper. Every citation in the body of your paper needs to have a reference to accompany it. Every reference needs to have a citation within the body of your paper. You cannot list a reference that is not used directly in the paper. That's actually something some students don't know. You should not quote anything. So this paper is going to be worth 50 points, and this is a little higher than was in your syllabus, but I think that the amount of points should equate to the amount of work you're doing, and I felt like 40 wasn't enough. And this is how you'll be graded on that paper. In addition, when you submit your paper, you'll submit it right here. Never submit submission text. Always submit a document, please. Through this, you will also go through Safe Assign, and so there's going to be a plagiarism check on your paper, so be very cognizant of that. You never don't use your own words. Just always use your own words. All right, well, if you have any questions, by all means, please email me. I'm Rana. On this paper, a little bit better to answer the questions than Brian. And I hope you have an excellent week. You'll notice you have 2 weeks to complete this paper, and you really don't have an assignment next week other than a quiz. And so really now's your opportunity to dedicate your time to this. I hope you have a great week.